so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just very simply put something into a session variable and pull it back out. Okay, so I'm going to start by creating a new project. And ASP.NET Core. I'll call this session demo. Default settings, create. And you're going to notice on the Microsoft Docs, one of the first things you have to do is in your program CS, you have to basically enable sessions on the server. And so program.cs, and we need a couple lines of code. So after add controllers with views, we all know that the order of the middleware calls matters. We're going to do builder services. You might have seen me code this one a little bit differently in the past. Add distributed memory cache is, again, kind of saying enable this to go into RAM, right? These session IDs can go into RAM. And then I'm going to do builder services add session. Now this is an interesting code snippet because we can set a timeout from the server when to expire this session. So I'm going to say from seconds, and I'm going to expire this maybe in 5 seconds. So we'll kind of see how this goes, but I'm going to set this cookie to expire in five seconds. Okay, so there's 3 lines that we have to add. Add distributed memory cache. This basically says, hey, you can store the session IDs on the server. This says, hey, expire these sessions in a very short duration. And then down below, again, exactly in this location. And then down below, above the map controller route, we just have to say app.useSession. Okay, now this is going to allow us access to create session variables. I'm going to do this. I'm going to mock up like a user login. Okay, and so what I'll do is I'll go to model, and I'm going to add a class, and it's just going to be a fake, user class, as if this would be my user that's going to log in. I'm going to give an ID, which is an int, a username, which is a string, and a password. Okay, so not a very complex user class. Okay, so now I'm going to make a controller to basically allow the user to log in. And so I will add a controller. And let's just say this is like a login for a student. So I'll call this my student controller. And the default method here, I'm just going to make a /login public iaction result login. And this is going to be an HTTP GET. And we're going to return to view, which then I need to make a student folder inside of my views. So add a folder called student, because that's the name of my controller. And then I need to make a login razor view. So I'm going to add a view called login and delete this template stuff here. With a login page, and I'm just going to go to get bootstrap, and I'm just going to bring in kind of a form for a login. And you can kind of go here and see this kind of generic email address and password form, which you can copy this on the Bootstrap docs and just kind of bring this in here. Now, the ASP action here will be login, and the method will be post. And I'm going to change I'm going to add these tag helpers. This login needs to work with my user model. So I'm going to say app model. And I think I could just say student. It might need to give it a full path. Semicolon. Oh, thank you. I named it something different. Give it the right name, it works. So now we have user, and this is going to be an input for, I'll do ASP4 and let that, we'll say username, ASP4 username, and ASP4 username. Okay, and I think that's all I really need to do to change that up. I'm going to do the same thing for my password. ASP4 might have to do a little troubleshooting here. But nonetheless, there's my username, there's my password, there's my button to submit. When I submit, it should go to the login post method, of which we're going to make an HTTP post. Public iAction result login with my user. And I'm going to have to bring in the models. So bring in using session demo models up top. So user is now recognized. And I'm just going to say return to the view. I'm just going to put a breakpoint in right here to make sure that my user is being received when I post the data. And then we're going to save some user information into session. And so if I boot this up with debugging to hit my breakpoint, I should be able to go to /student/login to hit the get. Let that boot up. All right, /student/login. We hit our login page. If I say admin, password of admin, and I hit submit, we hit our post. And if I hover over the variable, our user, password and username are being sent back to our controller. So this is correct. Now, next concept to learn, so we've just kind of wired this up to be ready to go. In a controller, we have HTTP context. And by the way, there's content, NT, and there's context. I've made the mistake of typing content on more than one occasion. That is not correct. It is HTTP context dot session dot look at the methods that are available to us. In session, if I look at setters, look what we can do. We can set a string or we can set an int. So this session, okay, is a property, okay, of the abstract class HTTP context. So here we're saying the class of context session property. And when we call the setters, we got set string and we got set int 32. Maybe that's all you need to work with are strings and ints, but also you can work with more complex types without a whole lot of legwork. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce this concept of extension methods. Okay, again, what we're going to do is we're going to extend this iSession interface. You see this session property returns an iSession data type. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to extend iSession to give us more methods to work with, more mutators. We're going to be able to set objects, not just set ints and strings. We're going to set objects now to be able to put our whole user inside of session, not just like individual variables, but to put a whole object. Okay, so that's what we're going to do inside of models. I just want to show you that because we haven't really done a whole lot with extension methods, and that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to create a class, and this is boilerplate. You can take this if you've coded this before, and I think you guys have. This is verbatim what we've typed. You can change the name of the methods. Now there's a couple things here. This is a public static class. Okay, that's the first thing, is the name of this class here doesn't matter much. How we extend something, the syntax is interesting. This is not a normal syntax. What we're extending is right here on line 7. See what I've highlighted? We are saying extend this iSession interface. We're going to call it session, but that line right there that I'm highlighting, that is how we determined what methods we're adding this to. So the method we're creating is called setObject. It can take a generic type, so whatever type that you give it, it can take any object type. And what we do inside of here is we say, okay, this session set string, so we're going to take what's called a JSON serializer, basically take this object, convert it to JSON, and save it in a string. And value is the third argument here. Values type is type T, it's a generic type. So we could pass it users, we could pass it products, we could pass it any object that you have, right? This is the idea of generics. Okay, so to get that out of the way, this is putting data in. This is the setter, and the getter is the same thing. We've now added two methods, the method called setObject, the method called getObject. This serializes it into JSON on the way in, ultimately a string that's JSON in that string. And here on the way out, we look at the key, we call get key, and then we deserialize it back into the data type. So here we take the user, convert it to a string. Here we take the string and convert it, deserialize it back into a user. So this is converting between data types, whatever the data type is, into JSON, into a string, from a string into JSON, back into the data type. And if the key is not a good key, you could just see here we're going to return null. Or default type here. So, okay, what does this allow us to do? Let's kind of close this up, go back to our student controller. Now in my HTTP context session, I can do a set and look at our new method. We have setObject, a key and a value here. SetObject, we have to pass it a key, call it current user, and a value of the object u. Awesome. So now when we post to our login form, and maybe what we do is we return home. So I'm going to return redirect to action index controller on home. All right, so we log in, we put the user in a session variable, and we redirect to home. Let's go back to the view for home. If I go Solution Explorer, and I go Views, Home, Index, up here, now I could say, okay, do I have a user equals now? Notice what's out front is context. So if you're accessing a session variable from the view, we are using the context class, okay, that belongs to these Razor pages. Okay, this is actually, it looks like a property. Okay, so we're using context instead of when we were in a controller, we're using HTTP context. But both HTTP context and context have access to session, and I'll show you. See, it's the same property here. Context.session is the same as HTTP context in the controller. Okay, and because we overrode the interface, we can go to get, we call it object, get object. We put the type here, get the user. We put the key as our first argument. What do we call it? We called the key current user. And if nothing, if there is no user, I did that wrong. Hold on, let me close my parenthesis here and close that there and make sure I got that right. Okay, so if this is null, notice it'll put a new user into user, which has an empty username and an empty password. Okay, so this double question mark null coalescing operator, if this returns null, then it does this instead. But of course, if it can read out of a session, then it will put it there. And here I'm just going to say at user dot username. Okay, so I'll just put on my home page, I'll put the username on the home page. Just a simple read and write demonstration. Let's see what breaks, if anything breaks. Okay, so no username there at first. That's what I would expect. If I go to student login, I say admin and admin. Now check this out. I have this extension, you guys might remember this browser extension called Edit This Cookie. Okay, this is a Chrome extension. You can install it if you haven't installed it. Let's take a look at our cookies right now. And right now we could see there's one cookie here called anti-forgery. Okay, let me go ahead and submit this. I'll close this extension. Let me submit this. Notice I have my username now posted, so I've put into session, I've read it out, and take a look. I now have this session cookie that's being saved. Remember how long we saved it for? 5 seconds, right? So in theory, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the cookie is now expired. If I refresh the page, the admin goes away. Okay? And so the cookie is still visible, it's still there. Okay, so we created a session variable, we put something in there, it expired after 5 seconds. You can see the expiration date and time right there. And yeah, that's an example of creating a cookie. A session variable, putting in it a cookie. Now, of course, you can go back into here and change the expiration. Right? You can change from seconds to from minutes. You can make it, if I say time span dot from, we got days on here, right? So these cookies can last a long time. Also, remember, we don't want to store critical information in here, and there is an upper limitation for how much information you can store in a cookie. Remember, a cookie is a file saved on the client. It's like 4,096 bytes. It's not or maybe that was kilobytes, but the point is it's not infinite storage like a database. Okay, and so you got these different ways you can configure your cookies from seconds, minutes, and so on. So in that demo, I did a write operation, right? I wrote into a session object. We made a cookie, whatever, called current user. We did set object, and then I did a read operation in the view. Okay, so on the student controller, no, student, where are we at? Here it is. I did a read operation here, and remember there was HTTP context to write, and then here context in the view. You could, use HTTP context here. Again, so let's see, does that look right? You could do that, and then you could send that user to the view, and then make the view strongly typed, and then do ASP4 and display the username that way. Okay, but the point is that this will be accessible in a bunch of areas on the site, right? It's accessible in different controllers. It's accessible in different views, all over the place, right? We no longer, have to worry about like, where's our data? Do I have access to it? Like, it's great. This is much better. So like in terms of like just thinking out loud here, like we talked about temp data, and temp data goes away. Like, why do you really want that? I mean, we're not storing like sensitive information. Like, why do you want your data to go away? I mean, maybe there's some advantages. I'm just thinking out loud here. But then it's like sessions. Okay, now the data persists a little bit longer, and I like that. So keep the data around, It's like, I like sessions more than I like temp data for that reason. It just kind of keeps it around a little bit longer, which then goes on to, well, let's just save it in a cookie, right? Because a cookie, you could set it to expire in 30 days, and unless the user actually goes into their browser and deletes their cookies, it's going to stick around, right? It's not just, you're not going to lose your data when the browser, closes by default on a session. I guess that's the last part of this demonstration to kind of show is that like this should go away. Like if I go here and I say, hey, keep this for 60 seconds or a minute, right? And I log in, and then I'll close the browser and reopen it up. It's kind of the demo, student login, and I say, okay, and then I go ahead and copy localhost, and I close, and then I kind of reopen that up, it goes away, right? So even though I said 60 seconds, it's still a session, and it still terminates when you close the browser. And just to demo one more time, that if I say admin and I copy and paste, like this is still the same session, still the same browser. If I copy localhost, of course, into a different browser with a different set of cookies, it's not there, right? So it is in Chrome, admin is still there, but it's obviously a different session than a Firefox session, right? So sessions are a per browser basis, not a per tab basis, right? If you close all the tabs, then the session goes away. Well, enter the next tool, which to me is like the best, is just a cookie. A cookie is going to persist data even longer than a session because there's just less ways for it to expire. A session can expire when the server tells it to, or when the client closes the browser window. So those are both ways that you lose the data. And so, I just in general, I kind of like the idea of cookies the best. Yeah.
Do cookies go across browsers? Did you just say that?
No, they're different. They're different.
Cookies are?
Yes.
Okay.
Cookies are not cross-browser. Like, you literally would have to clear your Chrome cookies, and that wouldn't touch your Firefox cookies. Those are different locations on the hard drive. So to kind of jump ahead, I will say that, I've read this book, I've done the book exercises, and I'm trying to extract what I think is the most relevant information out for you guys. If you dive into the book, I will point out that they wrap a lot of the logic for sessions into a C# class on page 345. Okay, they're taking these lines that we've written where we are setting objects and getting objects, and they encapsulate them in a C# class. And so I personally see the benefit, but I also feel like it's not necessarily for the scope of what we're doing. So there is, on page 345, a class, a C# class, where you take the logic that we've hard-coded in here and you put that logic into a class. Therefore, to actually set an object, you have to work with the methods out of that class. And it's like that's another layer of, hoops to jump through to ultimately work with session variables. I don't know. It's the way they choose to implement it. But moving on to page 356, and if I kind of pull up the PowerPoint, I guess I can show it on the PowerPoint because to jump ahead, we talked about a lot of this. The only thing I didn't talk about here is how to remove. So if you hit, if you say remove current user, well then that's another way of getting rid of the session, right? It's programmatically ending the session. Okay. Yes.
Would you do that on like a logout?
Yeah. That's a good. Yeah. That's perfect. So hit the /student/logout. How about that? You hit the logout. HTTP contest session remove current user. Student login. /student log out. There you go. And the cookie may still exist, but the data is not in there, right? If the data was in there, then it would read it and put it on the page. Right, so now we have demonstrated a session remove current user.